Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I am Ibrahim Aoudé. This program will be different from the other programs because the host is gonna become the host guest, and the guests will become the guest hosts. With us we have Noel Kent, Professor Emeritus, Department of Ethnic Studies, University of Hawaii, and Professor John Okamura, also Professor Emeritus at the Department of Ethnic Studies, University of Hawaii. We are gonna be having a conversation. The program is titled Ibrahim Aoudé, the Ethnic Studies Years. Now you know why we have this kind of flip, shall we say, in terms of who's the guest, who's the host. It's in terms of my impending retirement by the end of July of this year from the University of Hawaii Department of Ethnic Studies. So we go. Shoot, you folks.
Well, I'll start first then, since Noel didn't say anything. I'll start at the beginning in terms of what brought you to Hawaii. I know you came about 1969 and you had spent part of the 60s in swinging London. So what were the reasons you came to Hawaii and started your studies at our university?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I came to Hawaii to study, actually. And the reason Hawaii and not Chicago, although I went to Chicago first, and I have, my auntie there and my cousins, etc., and they wanted me to stay there. But I didn't want to experience a lot of snow because I had some snow experience in England, in the early 60s. So I didn't like that. So I had my brother here, the middle brother, studying at the University of Hawaii. He was in Chicago, then he ran to Hawaii, away from the snow. So that's why I came to Hawaii, and then to study, and I studied. First at Community College, Honolulu Community College, and then UHManoaEthnicStudies. And I had a degree in business at UHManoaEthnicStudies. Then I went to LA. I got master's in business, MBA. And then it was between economics and political science. But because I wanted to come back to Hawaii, because my girlfriend, who's now my wife, is from Hawaii, born and raised, etc. I wanted to come back. And even when I was in LA, I would, every quarter, at the end of the quarter, I would come and visit Hawaii and then go back to finish. So that's, why I was here. And then poli-sci, I studied poli-sci here and finished and started teaching. In fact, I connected with ethnic studies through Noel and through Dean Aligado, the late comrade Dean Aligado, who passed on early late last year. And since then it was a relationship between me and ethnic studies from 1976, because Noel was teaching there, and I was like what we call a lab leader for his course for about 2.5 years, 5 semesters. And then I left there only because I got a teaching assistantship from poli-sci, where I had my own course, which I taught for 2 semesters until I graduated.
Thank you. No?
Yeah, I remember that we you and I were doing some political work in the early 70s around various issues, local issues and other issues, and we became friends. And at some point, I was looking for someone to co-teach an ethnic studies course with me, and somehow, we got together on that. And then it became clear to people in ethnic studies that, we should bring you on, in a full-time position. And you began to teach the courses around the Middle East, which became a real fundamental course for the department also. So there's sort of a natural progression in which you, and then by that time you were doing your PhD study in political science. So you gradually began to be a full-time tenure track person in ethnic studies, and then you finished your dissertation, and the book was published, the Battle of Lebanon, and everything took off.
Yeah, yeah, you have a good memory. And I remember my first connection with you, and I think we mentioned it in an earlier program, was in 1975 when I was still studying my master's in business in LA. And then we met at the East-West Center, the Lincoln Hall, not Lincoln Hall, Jefferson Hall. And you came with your bike and all of that, the lobby of East-West Center, Jefferson Hall. And then, what you described. And then after finishing my PhD in political development, I started teaching courses like night school, in poli-sci and and business economics as well, because at that time business school still had its own courses in economics, business economics, and I would teach also a course in ethnic studies, as a lecturer, etc. And then what happened in 1985 in September, I got a position, not a position, a quarter position in liberal studies, And so I would teach, I would have that position in liberal studies, and then a course in ethnic studies until such times I had later on half a position in liberal studies and courses all over the place, Kapiolani Community College, once in Honolulu Community College, and evening classes, in poli-sci and in ethnic studies. No, not in ethnic studies, poli-sci and business, evening classes in business. All over the place, like especially Kapiolani Community College, and then ethnic studies in the daytime. And then 1990, I was hired full-time, tenure track, as associate professor actually in ethnic studies, because I was already promoted to associate professor at liberal studies. So that's what happened. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's how we met at Kapiolani Community College when I was also lecturing.
Yeah.
But Noel mentioned your work on Lebanon for your dissertation. I know it was published subsequently by Zed Press in London. So can you tell us a little about what you discussed in your book?
Yeah, actually, I am Palestinian. So my family left Palestine, had to flee Palestine after the establishment of or a little bit before actually, the establishment of the Zionist state in Palestine, the state of Israel, Palestine, as a settler colonial project, for Western imperialism, etc. So I grew up in Lebanon, and of course, I was a political animal even from the beginning. Even when we were like 6, 7 years old, we would talk about Palestine and the United States and Israel. all of that, and Lebanese politics. I witnessed a civil war in Lebanon, the first one in 1958, which didn't take a long time, just about 4 or 5 months, etc. But it was bloody, and we lived that kind of situation. So when the war happened in Lebanon, the second war in 1975, I had family there, and they were like displaced in their lives like 3 or 4 times actually, and they ended up in the last displacement was from Lebanon to Australia. Yeah, so now the family is in Australia. But the thing was that I wanted to know. I mean, well, what's really going on, etc. So I conducted that research, and I had field trips actually. The thing was, what was the role of the U.S. in all of this? What's the role of the Lebanese political system in engendering all kinds of contradictions that brought about, along with external influences, etc., brought about that conflagration. Yeah? So it was I called it Lebanon Dynamics of Conflict. The book that came out of Z Press came out in 1985, and just to mention that it became one at some point when it first came out, it became one of the 10 quote unquote most interesting books about Lebanon, at that time, maybe like in 70, I don't know. I don't know exactly when, maybe 80, 86, 87, that was it. So people know about it, but I did it under a pseudonym, pen name. And the reason for this, the people who helped me deal with the research, etc., and took me here and there, they said for their own protection, because it's not like, going on a demonstration, in Waikiki, they're like, it's life and death. For their own protection, not to mention, even their names, except like first name, in like the acknowledgements, but also if, I would use a pen name, and Z Press understood the situation and allowed me to do so.
So we're dealing with a book that was written about 35 years ago, and now we're that far away. And, basically you were describing a time in Lebanese history when there was civil war actually happening in the country, and their armed groups were arrayed against each other. What's your, if we move to 2021, we also find Lebanon's in deep crisis. I mean, there are huge numbers of Syrian refugees and others there. As editor of the, editor of the Middle Eastern, review, you basically, had your finger on the entire pulse of the whole region. So maybe you could share some thoughts about what's happened to Lebanon or the larger Middle East scene at this point.
Right. Yeah, this is an important question, actually, because although Lebanon is very small, like we have, in terms of population, around 4 or 5 million Lebanese, 500,000 Palestinians, some say like 700,000, be that as it may. But we have about 1.5 million Syrian who migrated, who moved. Some people call them refugees, others call them something else, like people who displaced people. Be that as it may, again, the fact of the matter that put a lot of pressure on Lebanon. Plus, now, because Lebanon, from the end of the war in 1975 till 1990. And there was, you know, a meeting that put an end to the war in the city of Taif in Saudi Arabia. So we had the Taif Accord in 1990 that began the period of what we call the Lebanese Second Republic, as opposed to the First Republic before the war. So that really also so that in fact the part of Lebanon was still under Israeli occupation. The south of Lebanon was under Israeli occupation. And from 1982, when the Israelis came over to Beirut, came all the way to Beirut, but with a lot of resistance, etc. But they had to leave, a few months later, and they had to clear even the mountains of Lebanon by 1985, but they stayed in the south, So that created some people who were like pro-American, pro-Israel, and others. They wanted to liberate the rest of Lebanon from Israeli occupation, etc. So from 1982, when the Israelis came in, a new resistance movement came about. And that resistance movement became like Hezbollah, the Party of God, which is based in the Shia thing. But the United States and Israel did not want Lebanon, to be out of Israeli influence. Okay, so that situation made the war between the resistance movement, which wasn't only Hezbollah, the Party of God, but there were also communists, there were also other nationalist parties, etc. They all kind of collaborated in defeating the Israelis and have them leave Lebanon in May 2000, actually, you see. But since then, we had discoveries of oil and gas in the Mediterranean. So the Israelis wanted to take part of the Lebanese exclusive economic zone, where there is a lot of oil and gas there. And the Americans helping, they posed as interlocutors, but actually they were on the side of the Israelis, trying to pressure the Lebanese to agree to the Israeli conditions and to give oil and gas, which is in the Lebanese exclusive economic zone, to the Israelis. And so because of all of that, I mean, I understand it's a complex situation, complicated, but because of all of that, the U.S. started siphoning U.S. dollars from Lebanon, because the economy is dollarized in Lebanon, and that was from the early 1990s. It began to be dollarized, and it's now dollarized. So when I go to Lebanon, for instance, I don't have to exchange dollar for Lebanese pounds. I just, give the driver a dollar, and he gives me money back in Lebanese pounds, etc. But the point is, to make a long story short, from now on, is that the U.S. also put sanctions on Lebanon, not only on Hezbollah, but they just boycott everything, in terms of what's happening in Lebanon. And so Lebanon is in a downfall, it's just falling, so what you call free fall, basically. Lebanon is happening, and now it's a matter of time, I think, to go into a war, a civil war in Lebanon. That would benefit the Israelis, the Americans, hoping to get rid of any resistance against Israel, etc., and any resistance against the political system in Lebanon that is so corrupt, you know, that is really, now like 60% of the Lebanese are under the poverty line, and a lot of them, beyond the 60%, hover a little bit over the poverty line. So it's really a mess. And the situation is getting worse. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if a civil war occurs or if an Israeli attack would happen, just like as the Israelis have been attacking Syria for the past 5-6 years.
Well, thank you for that analysis of Lebanon. But over the years, you also used to discuss the situation in Egypt with me. And you always used to visit Egypt each year in the summer. And you used to talk about writing a book about Egypt.
Yeah,
Can you let us know what you think is going on in Egypt now at the present?
Thanks. Actually, I wrote in 1994 an article that became the lead article in Arab Studies Quarterly, which deals with the history and the geography and the culture of the Arabs and Arab Americans and Arabs in the diaspora. I looked at it as an outline for a larger work. Right? So I had that in mind, and you know, as you mentioned, I would visit Egypt, you know, on a yearly basis, you know, in the summer, and I developed a lot of you know, connections, contacts, and all of that. So those kinds of trips helped me understand, you know, or better understand Egypt, because you know, I'm getting it from the horse's mouth, from like research institutes. I go and you know, interview them. I go to the the National Bank of Egypt, and I do research about the economy and all of that, you know. So it was a good thing, you know, to be able to better understand Egypt, because Egypt is the focal point in terms of the Arab world, especially because of its you know, history. I mean, I'm not talking about the pharaohs, but I'm talking, like, say, from the 1940s of the last century on. And especially, I was interested in what happened in 2011 in Egypt, which was the uprising. You know, it was you know, uprising where you had like 15 million people on the streets all over Egypt. 15 million people on the streets out of a population of, let's say, a maximum of 100 million at that time. You're talking about, say, if it is the United States, you have over 45 million people on the streets. You can see like what happens when you had like some kind of disturbance, the Capitol Hill, you know, I mean, just like a few hundred people going inside the state, the capital, I mean, U.S. Capitol. But that's a huge, you know, a huge transformation. But what I was able to study, and I was there in 2011 after the end of this uprising, which was an upheaval in the entire Arab world, actually. But
yes, the spring.
In terms of Egypt, I wanted to understand what it was like. I remember like Hillary Clinton saying like, oh, because there was an uprising in Tunisia before Egypt, you know, in like December 2010. And it finished on February 18th, 2011, the Tunisian one. So she would say, while that was going, you know, in Tunisia, she would say like, oh, in Egypt, that's not gonna happen. It will never happen, you know. And lo and behold, you know, come January, you know, it exploded January 25th, actually, after like Tunisia ended January 18th, 2011. January 25th, 2011, Egypt uprising begins, you know. So she had to swallow her words, actually, basically. But the thing is that it was a very promising uprising, you know, because they want to change corruption and all of that kind of stuff. And the people, like you had at that time, 40% poverty in Egypt, you know, which was huge. And that's why people, like, the slogans were like, we want bread, dignity, freedom, you know what I'm saying? But bread, they wanted bread, yeah? Bread meaning not only bread, but, you know. Anyway, so the thing then was very important to see how the United States was able, through its operatives on the ground and operatives in the state system, etc., how to contain the uprising and move it towards a military dictatorship again, you know, because the military took over after they told basically President Mubarak, that's it, buddy, your number is up. And they put a military, council as, to lead Egypt and so on. And they had done the same thing in Tunisia. Tunisia, they were able to contain it in such a way to keep like their influence in the state of Tunisia, American influence in the state of Tunisia. So that's an interesting thing. I wrote about maybe 2-3 articles about those kinds of events, the uprising, etc. Trying to understand that. I would still want to do a book about Egypt. I'm hoping, like, after I retire, I begin doing that. But what delayed it was a number of things. I'm the editor of Arab Studies Quarterly now, and how I got to be editor, it was because of my publishing in 1994, the one in Egypt. They liked it and they started collaborating with the editors then and so on, until they asked me to be book review editor in 1990, and then associate editor, and then since 2005 I've been the editor. Yeah.
Ibrahim, if I can just raise another question here. I think John and you and myself all think of ourselves as public intellectuals, meaning that we have commitments to social progress and social justice and the betterment of our communities. And you've had this show which we're on right now. You've been running this for many years, and this is part of your legacy, part of the contributions you've made as a public intellectual. Do you want to say something about that? I think that would be in order here also. What motivated you to sort of step out of your academic role and into the role of a host on a television program?
Yeah. Well, funny you ask. You know why? Because actually it was you. I'm gonna blame you for that. Because you mentioned, like, Ibrahim, there's this slot at the public TV, not public TV, but the educational, the educational channel. And why don't you go and see what's happening? So I said, okay. I didn't know what I was getting into, and then I met the folks and we talked, and so it was since 2001, spring 2001 we started. And then my role was, produce the show and then host it. And then, we did all kinds of things, like about Hawaiian issues, local issues, issues about the Middle East, about civil liberties, about the homeless in Hawaii, the indigenous struggles in Hawaii. And, it's been I remember Linda Engelberg, who was the head of the audiovisual at Sinclair Library before she retired. She was telling me like she was surprised. That's her words. Those are her words. That she was surprised how much demand there was or on those programs. People use it. Students, other classes use that one, and she was surprised that it was a lot of usage and a lot of demand for those programs. So I'm happy with that as a public intellectual, as you said. And of course, you and I, um, um, we have been in the struggle for like workers' rights and against evictions and all of that in Hawaii. So we did a number of, uh, you know, activities in Hawaii. And that is part of the ethnic studies legacy in terms of connecting um, like uh, communities that are not are disadvantaged, connecting them with the university, because the university usually is town gown, like legislature and business, Merchant Street and all of that, basically, and a few things here and there, but nothing in terms of the disadvantaged communities that we were dealing with, and we were supporting, and they were supporting us, etc. So that's the intellectual, legacy that we have as public intellectuals.
I was going to segue into discussion about your work regarding Hawaii, but I have one last question about your work, not just as an intellectual, but as an advocate, an activist. And that's how difficult has it been for you to support the Palestinian struggle from Hawaii, about halfway around the world?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, very important as well. It's difficult because I mean, you look at U.S. policy, it's pro-Israel against the Palestinians. Basically, they would tell you otherwise, but I can debate them anytime they want to, about that. Um, so I mean, when I say they, I mean like State Department or anybody else, intellectual or not. The fact of the matter, the U.S. is with the state of Israel against the Palestinians. Otherwise, if they talk about human rights, etc., why do they shut up against the human rights of the Palestinian people and Israel's violation of the human rights of Palestinians who are Israeli citizens inside Israel as it was created in 1948 in Palestine? Those guys are living third, if not fourth, third, if not fourth class citizens, because there is also in Palestine separation or distinction between Jews from the Arab countries and Jews from Western Europe, or from the United States. And also, if you are a black Jew, like Ethiopian, you're like third class, and second class is the Jews from the Arab world, and they call them Arab Jews. And some Israelis who are of Arab origin, they call themselves Arab Jews. And in fact, one of them has a book called Arab Jews, about 10 years ago or something. At any rate, so because of that, it's very difficult to, make headway in terms of, the Palestinian situation here, especially because of the culture, U.S. culture in general, is pro-Israel, and anti-Arab, and all these stereotypes about the Arabs and Muslims, and every Arab is Muslim, and every Muslim, is no good, and all of that kind of thing. And it's not true. Like, I'm Arab, I'm Palestinian. I'm not Muslim. My family is Christian, Eastern Orthodox Christian. Yeah, but that's no big deal for us, you know, whether you're Christian or whatever, you know, it's what culture you belong to and all of that, you know, and I am Arab American, you know, but it doesn't mean if you're Arab American, you forget about your Arabness or Palestinianness, etc., because we have a saying, he who denies his roots has no roots, you know what I'm saying? So you won't be here, you won't be there. So you gotta like own it as it is, and then go for human rights, I mean real human rights and national rights and sovereignty for the Palestinians and their practice of sovereignty and so forth. So it's very difficult among, you know, like this culture that's like pro-Zionist, etc.
Talking about this, you're on the Canary list, aren't you?
Yeah, well, yeah, they were after me. You talk about that, Noel, because we had a program on that, you know, the Canary Mission, right?
Hawaiian Mission, yes, I regard that as an honor.
Yeah.
And, some of us who've basically supported Palestinian causes over the years have been placed by some Zionist organizations, especially academics,
Yeah.
those of us teaching in colleges, universities, we've been placed on this Canary Mission list, which basically is a warning to employers and universities that hire faculty that these people are sympathize with the Palestinian cause and therefore they're anti-Israeli or anti-Semitic, which is ridiculous, and that you basically shouldn't hire them. So basically it represents a kind of attempt to blacklist professors or people in the academic world who've been involved in supporting Palestinian rights over the years. So there's probably about 4 or 5 of us at UH who are on this list, and I think it's, to my mind, it's a list of honor. But dangerous. It's also dangerous in the sense that young faculty who find their way on the list can basically find themselves blacklisted from employment
Right. We did a couple, more than a couple of programs on that, but one called the Canary Mission. And there was you, George Hudis, and Cindy Franklin. So 3 Jews and a Palestinian on the show, and all anti-Zionist, you know. And then, like, if they call me anti-Semite because, you know, I am anti-Zionist, they would call you guys self-hating Jews because you are against the state of Israel and Palestine and its practices, etc. And you say that it's not in our name as Jews, you would be doing that, you know. We don't allow you to do that. You don't have our permission to do that, you know. So this notion about anti-Semitism equal anti-Zionism is really very bad, because what would you do with the Jews who are against Zionism? What do you call them? Self-hating Jews, as they call them, as they do call them. They call you self-hating Jew. So it is, you know, something important. In fact, I just finished a Zoom session with my students. I had 2 presentations on the ethnic cleansing of Palestine by Ilan Pape, who's an Israeli Jew of German origin, born in Palestine. He calls himself a Palestinian, and his folks, I don't know if they're still alive, but they are or were, you know, Holocaust survivors. And he is, you know, this ethnic cleansing of Palestine 2007 book, you know, really lays it out. The crimes against humanity and against the Palestinian people's sovereignty that the Zionist forces did against the Arabs, and, you know, killing and wiping out villages, you know, I mean, just massacring people. You know, and then later on, when the State of Israel was established in March 10th, 1948, they continued doing this as Israel, you know, not as like Zionists, but as Israel, Israelis who are, of course, Zionists. Yeah. So it's an interesting thing. And this is why we have a lot of work to do here. But the thing is that more and more Jews and others of good conscience are supporting the Palestinian cause and putting a lot of pressure, and not only here, but in Europe. And so the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement against the state of Israel and Palestine has gained ground to the point that Netanyahu, who is now the prime minister of the state of Israel and Palestine, says this is like an existential threat to to the state of Israel, is boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And we're not telling people to, be forced to do it, but if they are, supportive of human rights and national rights of the Palestinians and their sovereignty and just humanity, then they would boycott, divest, or sanction. I mean, we have a number of churches that are doing this in Europe and here in the United States, and the movement is moving forward and progressing very well.
And that fight is a fight against racism in general and discrimination, any kind of discrimination against minorities. I mean, because it's all connected, and many of the same people are involved in these.
Right. Black Lives Matter, Palestinian Lives Matter, because these guys over there, the Israelis, they shoot you, even if you're not doing anything. And there are a number of videos and all of that about, shooting somebody while walking. They just shoot him and they say, oh, he was gonna kill us, or whatever. I mean, it's not baloney. It's all documented. You can go to YouTube and watch a lot of that, to the point that there were Israeli soldiers who served in the West Bank. They started having like, they established a group to talk about against serving in the West Bank, because they saw violating the rights of Palestinians and taking over their lands and villages, etc. Another book that is good by another Israeli Jew, the general's son, Nico Pellet, whose father, Nico Pellet, was one of the top generals in the state of Israel and Palestine, and he was one of the instigators for the 1967 war, because saying that we should attack Egypt before their army would be ready for defending itself very well. And sure enough, that happened. And so Nico Pellet talks about the crimes that the state of Israel has been doing over, to the Palestinians, So that's a book called The General's Son, easy to read. And this guy is also, with credentials, a Zionist with credentials who became anti-Zionist, and from a Zionist to a self-hating Jew, according to the Zionists.
Well, I wanted to ask you the same question I asked Noel when we interviewed him. What is your analysis from a political economy perspective of contemporary Hawaii?
I don't only teach about the Middle East, but I taught a bunch of classes, economic change and Hawaii's people, Hawaii and the Pacific, ethnic identity. I taught that race and ethnicity in Hawaii, social movements in Hawaii, and a bunch of other talks and all of that. So, and I've written a number of things about that and edited 3 issues of, the
social process.
Hawaii social process in Hawaii. One in 1994 came out, one in 1999, and one in 2001. The 1994 one is called The Political Economy of Hawaii, and nice selection of of chapters or articles. The other one was called in 1991 The Ethnic Studies Story: Politics and Social Movements in Hawaii. Essays in the honor of Marian Kelly, our late colleague Marian, who was a giant in terms of anthropology in terms of Hawaii. And the last one was about globalization, Hawaii, globalization in Hawaii. So those ones and my teaching and my ongoing research in Hawaii allow me to have an analysis of Hawaii along lines of class analysis to show that in fact there is a relationship among multiple dimensions in society, that relationship of the dimensions of class, ethnicity, race, gender, and all of that. So what is the relationship among that? And what is you are an expert in terms of race and ethnicity in Hawaii, and you have like 5 books, 6 books. I forgot the count. And I use some of your work in my classes. I use Noel's work in my classes, like Hawaii under the influence, islands under the influence. So it's these are very important books, and we all did the research about Hawaii, etc. And I agree with your analysis about the organizing principle in Hawaii is ethnicity, not race, although it used to be, but now primarily ethnicity. And I know you do not deny class and all of that. I mean, how can one deny it? To me, I differ in one thing, which is the organizing principle of any country, or any society. Like in England, it's class, primarily. On the continent, US is race, especially with slavery, etc. Here it was race, now it's ethnicity. So the organizing principle is different from an analysis of what's really going on, and tells you why this organizing principle here, why this organizing principle there. The main thing, like for the blacks, slave owners in the United States, especially the Black Belt South, was to make profit as much as possible. How do you make profit? You have to have slaves, and they did slaves, and they want to expand the states, that are slave states, etc. Missouri would be one major example of that, which they lost, the South lost in that regard. Be that as it may, they want this, but to make the whites who are poor also with them, they differentiate them from the blacks, so they begin having like this ideology of race, so to divide them and have like the poor white with the slave owner against the black, so I am higher, one notch higher. In Hawaii, similarly, Filipinos, Hawaiians, Samoans, Marshall Islands people, etc., are on the bottom, at the bottom of the ladder. But this is, and then you begin to have like hatred of the Marshallese, for instance, or the Micronesian, by whom? By people who are Hawaiian, who are also like, downtrodden, oppressed, and the rest of it, you see? So that kind of organizing principle is very important to understand, etc., and see why this is happening. And the only way one can do that is by having a class analysis about Hawaii. And, Noel talked about it, I talked about it, you talk about class as well. But your main focus is about how those minorities, Filipinos, Hawaiians, etc., are not served in this particular society. But that society that is organized on, or ethnicity is the organizing principle, it is so because of the class nature of society. If ethnicity is no longer good for them, they'll find something else. To give you an example, in Lebanon, for instance, it's Christian versus Muslim. They had it, Christian versus Muslim. Well, and then it didn't work. I mean, at the end, it worked for a while, and people were killing each other if you're Christian, Muslim, etc. And now a lot of Christians are with a lot of Muslims, you know, in terms of resistance against Israel. But now it is because not all Muslims have the same sect. There is Sunni Muslims, there are Shia Muslims. Now it is Sunni Shia. You see what I'm saying? Not Christian Muslim. So they change it so long as it serves their own interests, you know. And of course, Western, I mean, for the Middle East, Western, you know, politics intervenes to encourage this kind of organizing principle or that or the other thing. So I hope I answered this thing.
Thank you.
The past is always there. The past is never past. I mean, if we look at the denial of voting rights to Black voters throughout the South now, you know, this you can draw a direct line back to the slave period.
Absolutely.
In terms of the denial of humanity, rights, any sense of equal participation in society. So that there's always the past lurking, you know, there. You know, it's always that connection.
Yeah. You know, another thing, like that's why I like, you know, Hawaiian phenomenology, you know, and you know, Hawaiian philosophy. It's important, like, to the past guides you, you know, and if you want to look to the future, you better look to the past first to be guided. It's not, you know, it's different from the past or history repeats itself, which is a baloney thing. I don't think it does, because things move along and events and variables completely change and all of that. So history never repeats itself. I'm sorry. But as Hegel says, history repeats itself once as farce, and the second time is as tragedy. So it means it doesn't repeat itself, you know. So anyway, that's an important thing to mention, like how like we are in Hawaii, and to really understand Hawaii's politics, you have to understand, you know, Hawaii before contact, and then how it developed and how capitalism came to Hawaii and all of that, then the plantation system and all of this, you know. And the one, in terms of the organizing principle, going back to John's, you know, question, is that when you have like a Filipino camp and a Japanese camp, etc., what is that for? They did it on purpose because they didn't want the people to come together, you know, because then they would be against the plantation owners, etc., etc. So anyway, I just wanted to mention this. We have less than 9 minutes or so, which is fine. Oh, 5 minutes left. Okay, which is good. Actually, we have still time. I mean, good that we have time still.
Well, the camps no longer exist, but we do have affluent neighborhoods now.
Yeah.
And my argument is the dominant groups are Hawaii's, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans. They live in the same upscale neighborhoods, Mānoa, East Honolulu. They send their kids to the same exclusive private schools, Punahou, Iolani. They intermarry also at high rates. So the kinds of divisions that historically the planters and the Hawaii's in general, who ruled Hawaii, tried to instill, no longer exist. We have a different society divided to some extent on class lines. So it's a different situation. And what complicates it very much so is the sovereignty movement. And I know that you've applied a class analysis also to the sovereignty movement. And for me, sometimes I wonder, to what extent are they getting support from other groups based on class?
Yeah. 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 No, I agree completely with that. You know, it's important to look at the sovereignty movement and not look at it as one whole thing, you know. But there are divisions among them. Everybody knows that, and so on. And some, as you know, and those divisions are very important. You know, we don't. There's no need to deal with that here. But the question is that, you know, that's why you have organizing principles to like conceal the class aspect of things, you know. And so I am Japanese, even though I might be homeless, you know, to give like the extreme example. But I think I love George Ariyoshi, you know, as an example. You know what I'm saying? He has nothing to do with you. Probably his policies put you down there. I don't know, plus other things like Reagan and the rest of it. So class consciousness is important. And that's why what needs to be done is educating people to see the connection among those. And that's why we have like this positive ethnic identity to say like, I'm Japanese, I'm proud of being Japanese, American, you know, or Japanese, Hawaiian, whatever. But I also respect the others. You see what I'm saying? And I look at what is going on in society. If I look at what's going on in society and say, okay, there are homeless who are Japanese and Hawaiians and this, and okay, let's unite along those lines. But that requires education and requires a lot of understanding by the people themselves through education. And who's going to educate them? The public intellectual, you know, and political organizations with public intellectuals in it to guide a movement to move away from those organizing principles into another one, maybe like to open up the question of the class situation and deal with it that way, along things that are important, like, you know, everybody now, you know, with the COVID-19, a lot of them can't pay the rent. I mean, you don't have to be, you know, like Hawaiian not to pay the rent, but it could be Haole, you know, which is another ethnic group, by the way, in Hawaii. Could be Haole and cannot pay the rent, but you might be with Trump, you know, or you can be Japanese not paying the rent, but you are with Trump, you know, you support Trump, etc. So there's less than 2 minutes left, Erica tells me.
For him.
Yes.
So you're on the eve of retirement. Tell us something about what your legacy. What do you think? What have you? What's your career meant in 10 words or less, or something like that? What are you thinking now about the career you've had?
Yeah, it was very rewarding. I'm thankful for Hawaii and for ethnic studies. I contributed as a public intellectual to Hawaii and to ethnic studies, but at the same time, you know, I benefited a lot, you know, intellectually and materially and all of that from that experience. And I never will exchange it for anything in the world. And it showed me the relationship between the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, the way, you know, the more radical guys understand it, and the Palestinian movement, and the movement for liberation of humanity and mankind, you know. You know, for instance, this climate, you know, it affects us here and it affects us everywhere, you know. So wrapping up, I would say mahalo nui loa for the guest hosts. And I hope the host guest was okay for you as guest host. And thank you very much. And we shall continue with this program a little bit after my retirement as well, you know, for maybe another semester or two or more, actually. We'll figure that out. So thank you very much.
Thank
and
you.
I want to thank Erica.
Thank you, Ibrahim,
Thank you,
for sharing
Erica.
your thoughts with us.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, and mahalo nui loa, and see you folks next month. Aloha.